Good afternoon to all my walking the dog viewers and listeners. I'm here in one of the back lanes. I've probably walked about 3/4 of a mile or something. I decided to come out because I'd been doing some work preparing my talk at the Heritage Party, which I'm doing on Saturday. And I thought the time has come for some fresh air. So the sun was shining and I thought, right, let's get out and record a little bit of Poppy the dog. There's no other way for me to do this than to say to you as an audience that I have some sad news. And that is that Poppy the dog is no longer with us. A big shock to me, the family, which actually all sort of came to a head about 2 days before my birthday. So we're talking about 3 weeks ago now. And it's taken me up until now to sort of decide quite how to deal with announcing things. But it was unexpected. Poppy suddenly started to sort of show that she wasn't feeling too good, and a trip to the vet suggested that this was because she had some bad teeth, and so we'd ended up having her booked in to have those teeth taken out basically. But in a very short space of time it emerged that Poppy had got she had kidney failure, and poor Poppy became very poorly very, very quickly until we had to make the decision to put her to sleep. And the dog owners out there will know exactly how tough that is. I have to say that the vets were absolutely brilliant. The lady vet and her team were really kind. And so, something which is very, very tough to do, they made it happen as nicely as they possibly could. And at the end of the day, we certainly didn't want Poppy to suffer, and clearly that was starting to happen. So I'm here coming out for a walk. I have done it a couple of times before, but I didn't quite feel in the mood for switching on a recorder and talking to you. I'll tell you my mistake today was that I've walked this distance, 3/4 of a mile roughly, and I've met some really lovely people and had some good conversations, including with a couple who had their dogs, and we ended up chatting about owning dogs and how hard it is when you lose them. But I got further down the road, and then of course I discovered that I hadn't pressed record. And it's a real shame because that was a very poignant little conversation with those two. They'd recently lost an older dog. They had a younger one still left, and they'd recently acquired another young one. But there was some very pleasant chat about how difficult it is. And of course I was quick to say to them that you can come out for a walk, but it is never the same. Let me just go up over this stile here. I'll have to watch it actually because these stones are very slippy, very shiny, very slippy. I'm just going to take a couple of little photographs for you. It's only just capturing a bit. So I've come up into what I've always known as the sheep field, and there's no sheep here today. The thing is, you're probably wondering what happens now. And I've been pondering this myself. But for today, I thought, well, okay, I know what to do. And this is that I have some audio that I took with Mr. Charles Mallet. It's one lunchtime, actually, back in the summer, where we took Poppy for a little walk down the road, pretty close to the UK Column Studio. Well, yeah, in the vicinity of the UK Column Studio. It was a very hot day, and of course we did have Poppy with us. And we walked along and we had a fascinating discussion about all sorts of things, where Charles was particularly talking about things to do with farming. And I found that very interesting. So I thought what I might do today is to cut away and let you listen to some of that recording. Won't do it all, we'll do some of it. And then I'll bring you back. And I thought it'd be really nice just to play out for a few minutes with some happy memories of Poppy. What am I going to do with walking the dog? Well, my instinct is that I don't stop. Yeah, I think in honour of Poppy, walking the dog will continue. We'll see who we meet on the way. We can still talk about matters of interest and some current events. And the couple that I stopped and talked to earlier on when we were talking about dogs, the man said to me, well, are you going to get another one? And I said, well, Charles has actually offered me one of his new puppy pack from his Labrador. I can't remember how many he said there were. I think 8, all boys. So would I like this sort of black Labrador puppy? And I had to say, I don't think so. Not because it wasn't a wonderful offer, but because I have enough on my plate without the extra demands of a puppy. That opportunity was there, but I can't really take it up. But the man that I was speaking to earlier said, well, the thing is, dogs have a way of finding you. I think that's probably true. And we'll see what happens. I quite fancy, or I'll say into the future, I think it might be nice to take on a rescue, because there's a very lovely dog rescue place not far away. Of course, some of the dogs sort of have that attractive allure and they go through the kennels quite quickly, and other ones, for whatever reason, other ones by age or sometimes ailments or looks end up spending a long time before anybody will take them on. So I think that's where my mind is tending to go, but the plan is nothing immediate because there's still lots of other work to be done. The walks are necessary because I can already tell that I've had a few weeks of losing my 1.75 hours a day walking exercise, so I'm very keen to get that re-established somehow. Well, that's about it. Life's tough, isn't it? But thank you all very much for joining me, and I'm going to say thank you all so much for the brilliant support that we get from the UK Column members, and we're really looking forward to our live event in Bristol in October where we'll be meeting up with some of you. Close the gate, and I'll say I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Well, hello to the UK column audience. This is a very special day because I'm walking Poppy the dog in rather different territory to the territory that I'm normally speaking about. So today we're in a little bit of an urban environment. We're just leaving Reynolds Park, which is the section of the business park in which the UK column studio is located, and we've crossed over the road, and we're going to move along to get a little bit closer to the countryside if we can. But what's special about today is that I have a gentleman with me. Welcome, Charles.
Thanks very much, Brian. It's lovely to have the chance to walk with you and, of course, the internet sensation that is Poppy the dog.
Yes, it's quite interesting, this one, because at the Light Festival that we went to, whatever it was, 3 weeks ago, a number of people came up to me straight away because Poppy was instantly recognisable by her yellow harness.
Yeah, no, she obviously got lots of well-deserved attention, but I hope she'll enjoy her new walk today. It is glorious. It's much hotter inside than it is outside, but we're inching towards feeling like it might be summer, which is a good change for a lot of us. It's been a bit of a miserable start to the year.
Yes, Charles, this is an interesting point. Just tell the audience a little bit about. So there's some things going on here which only dog walkers talk about, and I'm not going to talk about that to the audience. But I think we're all done, and Poppy's now fully motivated for a bit of a trot. Yeah, Charles, just tell the audience a little bit, about your farming activities, because I think most people are very interested in this subject of trying to be self-sufficient and growing your own food and keeping some of your own animals and things. So, my first question is, how long have you been doing that?
In earnest, about 4 years. 4 years with in effect, a meaningful return, which I would say is the inching closer towards self-sufficiency, not just in food, but also in electricity, in water, and just taking those steps that I've certainly thought about for years, and being able to slowly inch into a situation where you feel like you are exercising a greater degree of control over your own life. We had a discussion earlier this morning about all the various challenges that we face at the individual level, but at the family level, as society, where we perceive that things have gone wrong to the point where perhaps they can't be set back to a point that we might think that things are running okay. And my thought on any of this has always been that you start with what you can do yourself, and we all have different interests and different pulls and draws on our lives, but mine has always been very much concerned with the outdoors, with sort of space and wildlife, nature, and all that kind of thing. And I've seen certainly production of food and keeping of livestock as being an absolutely enormous part of that.
Yeah. I'm just going to interrupt very slightly because Poppy is here growling. I don't know whether people can hear this at all. And what she's looking at is and barking at. We'll just wait for the traffic to go past. So this is Poppy, very excited at a, what do we call it? It's not a statue,
it's
is
a
it?
sort of scale model of a cow, kind of plastic cow standing on top of a BT sort of cover for what presumed is all their comms wires.
So we're busy talking about farms and livestock, and then this very interesting, I don't know what it would be made out of, plastic probably, but it's, how high does that stand? Probably about
sort of 3.5 foot high, I suppose.
yeah, 3.5, 4 foot high. And Poppy wasn't quite sure whether it was real or not. So she decided to give it a good barking at. And the last time this happened, if I remember correctly, was when I was on a visit to Hereford. And in a particular part of the city, there is a very big bull, which is proper, I'll say proper artwork. It's certainly metal of some sort. And my goodness, Poppy walked all around this thing, growling at it, and she was very, very suspicious. So you never know what's going to happen when you're dog walking. So, Charles, sorry, I interrupted there because a little bit of fun. Just say again how long you'd actually been doing this?
On the livestock front, 4 years.
Right.
So that has meant quite a bit of trial and error and finding the best rhythm, on a sort of personal basis, because of course doing any of this comes at a great cost of time and effort. So I wouldn't have said there's a silver bullet. It's hard work, but you have to feel that what you do put into it, you are more than properly rewarded for. And I do feel that after 4 years, we've got to that stage in every respect. I do find it fascinating now, setting what I'm trying to achieve alongside a lot of the governmental and sort of extra-governmental policies that we see creeping in, and they all claim to be doing the same thing, which is to improve food supply and improve the environment. And the reality, certainly as I see it, is that the likely outcome is not an improvement in either case, but we specifically with our ground, we see without doubt an improvement of the soil that is beneath grass that's grazed by sheep, and a proper abundance of hedges that are managed correctly, and indeed lots of grasses and other things that come up, and the populations of butterflies and damselflies and dragonflies that are supported is phenomenal. And that's a massive change. It's very easy to see looking at neighbouring fields that are still sprayed and treated with all manner of chemicals and of course dug up all the time. There's a very, very stark contrast, and you can tell there are so many indicators, not least the wildlife that I described, but also of course birds of prey. You see birds of prey at the top of certainly one part of the food chain, because there's an abundance of what they would want to be eating on ground that's working in the way that it should, and therefore that whole ecosystem is working. But but mostly it's the idea that what you eat is what you want to eat. It's had no interference, and we talk a lot about the terrible treatment of farmers by supermarkets, by industry, and yet very few people feel like they're in a position to do anything about it. Most people feel that life has to involve a supermarket, and of course I accept completely that access to land and this sort of thing does make it challenging to do any of these things, but it is possible. And I've spoken about this before, depending on one's circumstances, to try and acquire a small bit of land, and that really is all you need if it is meat that you're wanting to produce. It is doable, and it does give you much more than a sense of satisfaction, but knowing that you're not ingesting chemicals and pharmaceutical products that absolutely for sure will have gone into almost
food.
any other food that you do consume, is good. And it makes you think an awful lot about all the other things that you can start to do. So that's sort of where I've been going with that.
Right, so if I interpret this correctly, lots of effort into being able to do enough to not support your family food-wise completely, but in order to make a significant difference to the...
No, it does. I mean, again, I think you have to start by really considering what outcomes you want insofar as what do you want to be able to eat. For so many years now, people have been led to believe that you should be able to go and get anything, eat anything, any time of year. No real regard for nutritional quality of any of the food you might be able to get. And you hear it now, they're really banging the drum for increased or enhanced sort of horticulture. Huge glasshouse construction, all sorts of indoor growing, out of season growing, and all kinds of innovation, but for what benefit? Benefiting the industry in terms of making money, or actually giving people something that's going to be good for them? And I think it's clear in most cases that really it's the benefit industry. It's not necessarily going to provide better nutrition for people, and therefore my personal view, and for those people, those among the audience that listened to the interview I did some time ago with John Cook, the Wiltshire dairy farmer who was a raw milk producer, I think he sets it out very well, and I would be sort of closer to subscribing to his view, which is actually that the nutritional requirements can be provided for by a very simple diet. There is a lot of nuance with this, particularly with regard to your blood type and whatnot, but you find what works, and then you find out the feasibility of being able to do it. And so it does takes a while to set up, but then you build a routine into it and you make it work. And when if you think about it the other way round, and you think about the man hours you'd have to work in order to generate particular income to buy the sort of food in the state that you would want it, and then you translate that back into doing it yourself, actually there's an enormous saving of time in effect, if that's how you do look at it, which is I think how I have to.
Now, one of the things I find very interesting in this conversation is that I live in a cottage. I've lived in this particular cottage for 40 years. That's a story in itself. But the cottages were originally built for farm labourers who worked on the big estate, the big local estate. And those cottages, when they were first built, would have been 2 up, 2 down, 2 rooms upstairs, 2 down, an outside toilet. So very, very basic accommodation. And in fact, you can still see between some of those cottages, you can still see that there's the remains of the old shared taps. So people obviously wouldn't even have water brought inside the house. So the living conditions, very basic. But what did the estate give the farm labourers? It gave them very big gardens. And I can't be sure of the exact length, but I think before some of it was sold off, the cottages would have had gardens that were probably 300 feet. So a little bit wider than the backs of the houses. That's a little bit of a strange thing. You have to look at a map to see, but so a 300-foot garden. And of course, what did the farm labourers do every moment that they weren't working on the estate? They were tending their own gardens in order to in order to grow food crops. And when I first moved into the cottage, one of my neighbours 2 doors up was a wonderful man called Gill, and his original working life had started by working on the local estate, mucking out the shire horses. It was his first job at the age of 11, and he subsequently stayed with the estate all his life. But when my wife and I bought the house, he had been looking after 4 of the gardens, because for a variety of reasons the people in 2 of the cottages either were not interested in the garden or couldn't work it properly, so he took it over. And if I looked across my fence, I would see these immaculate rows of vegetables: potatoes, carrots, broad beans, Brussels sprouts, parsnips, and whatever else he decided to grow on a particular year. They were all in immaculate rows. And he was a very generous man, because he would often turn up at the doorstep clutching a big handful of produce, whatever it might be. And of course he was the expert, so his carrots, for example, were always at least 4 times bigger than anything I could grow. And I always enjoyed chatting to him when he was out working. And of course his knowledge of the land and how to manage it, how to plant things, how to look after it was always a very key thing. And I've now come to realise that knowledge that Gill had in growing food from the land, this knowledge is going. A lot of people don't know how to do it anymore. But yes, it was just wonderful to see all these vegetables in their immaculate rows. And whatever else he did in the day, later in the afternoon, if it's summertime and it's cooled off, he would be out weeding, just gently moving up and down the rows with his bit of background noise there. Let's move on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely sort of memory to be able to draw on, but of course, as you say, the very significant and underlying point is that lifestyle is diminishing to the point of being forgotten by almost everybody, I would say, in our society. I think there are still, fortunately, many parts of the world where people are closer to living a life like that. But here, I would say that this has been a long time coming, and it's been a sales and marketing exercise from, I would say, most obviously the Victorian era.
So, I'm not sure. Just interrupting, Charles. Is this public? Yes, it is. I knew there was one. We'll let the horses go first.
Check out the high vis.
Yeah.
Why do you need to wear high vis on a bridleway? I don't know. But I would say it's sales marketing, and I think it goes back to the Victorian era where it was realised that the
Sorry. She's fine. She's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Young Horse. So I don't want to pop her out with too much coming down the hill.
Right, fair enough.
Thank you.
Okay.
So there we are. That's we just described. We got 2 lovely horses there. One, the lead horse, was a bit young, and I think the lady was a bit concerned Poppy might bark, but actually she's pretty good with. She's better with horses than plastic cows. Yeah.
Nice to see horses on a bridleway.
So remind me to pick that up on the way back, otherwise I'll be told off.
But yeah, I think the Victorian era, which of course is notable for a number of things, but perhaps most prominently what we would regard as the Industrial Revolution, or one of the Industrial Revolutions. And what that enabled people to do, both the state and the elites, let's say, was to sell people the idea that it was worth sacrificing skills and knowledge and experience for what was called leisure. And so it's no coincidence that sports, particularly, let's say, cricket, football, tennis, had either a renaissance or significant uplift during this period. People, areas were set aside for recreation, which might sound innocuous enough, but when you think about the consequence of that, which was that people were giving up their own practical skills in order to allow machines to do things that they could have done themselves previously, we can quite easily track the path that has led us to the idea that, for example, a digital currency is a good idea, because it's selling you a convenience that you wouldn't have otherwise necessarily thought you either wanted or needed, but suddenly it's there. Okay, admittedly, the sort of skill deficit in terms of digital currency doesn't necessarily transpose over the top of that. But the point is that with every one of these sorts of developments, people have become further removed from the sorts of things that they would have been previously able to do, and they are given the impression that their lives are being made easier. The sort of, I would say, the gigantic con of the labour-saving device, and applying this back to the land, livestock, eating, and all the rest of it. I think this is very well described by James Rebanks in his book An English Pastoral, and he's a farmer up in the Lake District, and I'll conclude with, I would say, an enormous inconsistency in his philosophy, but he talks about growing up at a time where his grandfather was just beginning to sort of bow out of a lifetime of agriculture, and he'd seen the transition towards mass mechanisation and chemicalisation and pharmaceuticalisation of the industry, and he recounts stories where you're talking exactly about, your chap Gill, and having an immaculate garden, being able to provide either all of or almost all the food that you required, and then to find that farmers themselves were thinking, well, I mean, there's this supermarket here now, so actually why don't we just rip up the vegetable garden and we'll go and buy this from a supermarket, and not appreciating at all what it is that they were actually doing by making that, frankly, extraordinary change. And Rebanks' book goes through his own sort of personal journey about how he came to realise the wrong-headedness of all that he and they had been doing to their land, and how they destroyed so much of the sort of micro ecosystems that had been taken for granted years earlier, and how all of these innovations, almost all of them, had actually had a detrimental result on the landscape, the environment, the quality of the food, but also their lifestyle. And he started to reverse all this. The inconsistency I mentioned there is that he's very proud to talk about reducing all the pharmaceutical intakes, particularly for his livestock, and yet when it came to the COVID-19 panic, he publicised the fact that he rushed off to receive an injection, which I found, I don't know, this is not a personal attack, this is more just a sort of reflection of the way in which people can be able to see certain things but not others, and to me it's completely extraordinary. But yes, as I say, I think the loss of skills is because people through what I describe as a sort of sales and marketing policy, they consider that the sacrifices they're making, or at least they don't even realise they're making them, are for their benefit, and I'm afraid they're not.
Yeah, and actually let's tell people we've come to this lovely little wooden bridge. So we came down the bridleway, and at the bottom there's a little stream running, and there's quite a substantial little wooden bridge, very rustic and covered in lichens and of varying colours, so it's clearly been here for a while. But Poppy's decided a good place to go is to have a paddle in the cool water and a drink, so she's done that. But it's quite a nice environment. There is a bit of traffic. This is moving past us on the other side of quite a big, thick hedgerow, and it heads up towards Dartmoor and some of the industries connected with the China clay industry. We'll talk about that maybe another time. But it's not a bad location, is it? What, 20 minutes from the UK Column studio. Gil was in my mind. The other thing I have to say is that Gil said to my wife and I in the very early years, and you should be okay because in your garden you've got gooseberries and white currants and red currants. So there was quite a big fruit cage when we first moved into the cottage. And Gil was very excited about this, and he said, well, of course, gooseberry wine is really excellent, and blackcurrant wine is very good. And he said, if you've never tried parsnip, I'd recommend that. And so Jill and I decided that for the whatever year that was, we'd give winemaking a go. We also had a small damson tree, and we set to and we made damson wine, parsnip wine, and gooseberry wine. And I have to say that the damson was utterly superb. The gooseberry wine, I think, was very good, and people who had it said they liked it. That wasn't quite for me, and but we got a lot of pleasure out of doing that. The story goes on, though, that the first year we made all these bottles of wine, and they were all perfect and drinkable and everything else, and we thought, well, this is nothing to this. And we did the same process the second year, and they were just not as good. And then you start to think, there's obviously more to this than meets the eye. But even with our garden as it is, so I said I think it might have been 300 foot in the days. We've still got 90 foot. And originally all of that was dug for vegetables when we first moved in. And then what happens, children come along, and I was also spending a lot of time at sea. And so the quick solution is to grass it. Oh. And that's the first stage where you start to take away what the land can produce. So I set to in lockdown, and I did two things. One is that I dug another small vegetable patch, which I've still got to work on because the aim is to make it slightly raised bed. But at least that allowed us to start growing some things. And then the other thing I did is put in a very small polytunnel. And in fact, I'd originally bought this thing because it gave me somewhere to stow items, because I was a bit short of storage space outside. And I just bought it off eBay. It came with not a proper polytunnel cover. It came with some other sort of plastic cover, but it lasted quite a while. Then the cover disintegrated, so I thought, okay, well, let's see what we can do. And I built a little 1 foot wall for it to stand on, which gave it a bit more height. And I also took the trouble to get some proper polytunnel plastic. We've now got that set up, but we haven't got the full technique of getting as much out of that little polytunnel as I think you can. But we've been working quite hard since lockdown to try and get back into the swing of growing things in our own garden. And this year's, as you said, we had a really bad start, so I didn't get out there doing all the things I should have. So I think that our promise to ourselves is that next year we are going to set to early and see whether we can get these things in full production. Yeah. So that will be fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's so rewarding in so many ways, and I think it is always remarkable how much you can produce off really not a very large space. I was reminded by your winemaking stories of how that gives a very good example of the way in which determination to just do something does have an effect. And we're all increasingly aghast at yet another tax or a theft for this, that and the other by the state. But one particularly sort of pernicious example is the duty upon the production of alcohol. But there is one significant anomaly, which is that you're allowed to produce and sell up to 7,000 litres of cider a year without any duty payable, and that's simply because all farmers, people who sort of work the land, everybody had apple trees, pears as well, of course, and therefore they would all make cider, and Revenue and Customs or Inland Revenue or whoever they were at that time just had to concede defeat in that there was no possible way they were ever going to manage this volume of in effect behaviour that didn't conform to their system, and so they just increased this threshold. And as I said, this is not just home production of cider, this is producing cider, if you want, commercially and selling it. And of course that's, I think, I'm always really heartened by that, because that's people just ignoring in effect a silly and unfair rule and just getting on with it. And of course it worked.
Now I'm really interested in this, and because another memory comes back that my village, like many others, had a cider press, and the pressing of cider from the combined orchards in the village. We have a sort of interesting traffic situation going on here.
Two-car traffic jam.
A gentleman does he want a C to reverse? I don't know. That's it. Yeah. So produce from the orchards in the village came together in a central location where the cider press was, and the production of that year's cider was a community. What's the word?
Activity.
Activity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so people were benefiting from, if they had one apple tree and they just had a few apples, that was added into what everybody else had, and ultimately cider was produced for the village. I believe the opening of when the cider was fully ready, that first night was a especially social event. But afterwards, cider was a drink. Well, really, it was a drink. It was a common drink, wasn't it? As opposed to being a sort of having to compete with beers and things. But yes, that was another thing connected with farming and food production in the land, which I wasn't lucky enough to see that press in action, but the press still exists. It's been preserved, and there's plenty of historical records about the village talking about the cider press. So yeah, did you say 7,000?
Yeah, 7,000. Yeah, absolutely. 7,000 litres.
Oh, litres.
Yeah,
right.
of cider, which is a lot. That's if you're going to consume that personally in the course of a year, then you're doing better than me. But I would say that's a good thing. But it's rather more the lesson to draw from it, which is actually that if people simply do not conform or comply, then the ability of, in this case, the state to do anything about it is very, very limited. And I say this in mind of the extraordinary push by DEFRA at the moment to get all keepers of all birds to register them as part of what they're calling a sort of enhanced biosecurity notification system because of what they're describing as the risk of avian influenza. But there are lots of critical parts to this, but one of which is that they put out a consultation last year, 2023, and nearly 3,500 people responded, which is quite a high figure for a consultation response. And the overwhelming majority, 75% of respondents, said that they didn't want there to be any change to the existing situation, which is that if you have a flock of more than 50 birds, then they require that you register. I would have to say that I don't think even that is fair enough. You look at a lot of other countries where it's completely different, and it doesn't seem necessary, but nonetheless, that was the status quo. The majority of people have said that's what they would like to stick with, and yet the government response, the DEFRA response is, well, we're not going to do that. We are going to tell absolutely everybody to register their birds, all of them. So even if you have one kept bird, it must be registered.
Yep.
In the new biosecurity state. And it's just very indicative of the way in which, well, it is, yeah, absolutely, it is. And so this is why, with the general election looming and all this sort of thing, something that crops up a bit is that actually, even if you do change the politicians, what would the likely result be, bearing in mind the tremendous bias and influence exerted upon the civil service and the policy makers? So I think that's something that it's always there to be considered.
Yeah. Wondering what our audience is thinking at the moment, because having you along with Poppy and myself, Charles, has got us into some really interesting discussion about matters to do with farming. I'm just going to say we're heading back to the UK Column studio now, as we have some other things to do in about half an hour. But I want to say that we're here on the edge of an area which is called Plimpton.
I think it's lovely. The route we've taken, we're just walking past a sort of thicket of brambles, but with foxgloves just poking out the top and a hawthorn hedge behind it. And we've seen a great variety of black alder and elder and hawthorn, as well as amazing honeysuckle sort of woven through the hedgerow. And we are minutes from an industrial park, and that is lovely to be able to walk out and see that at such close.
Well, I was going to say this because, to be fair to the little business park, it's light industry, isn't it? Light industrial park, where the UK Column's got the studio. The environment is very nice. There's lots of open grass. There's a lot of trees that have been planted, or trees that were in position have been left, and it's got a very soft feel for it. If we just mention one of the biggest people that are in there, the cooperative has a small distribution warehouse come lorry park. That takes up quite a big area, but the rest of the businesses are all relatively small. They might be to do with preservation of buildings. There's some design, specialised design on small electrical, mechanical components, sign making. There's people doing things to do with tinted glass in cars. So there's quite a spectrum of people with their different businesses. But I have to say that when you arrive in the morning at the business park itself, it's a nice environment. You don't feel that you're coming into some harsh industrial area. It's got a nice feel to it. And Plimpton, which was a village, let's get my geography right, northeast of Plymouth, sitting on the River Plym, was a small little country town in its day. There was a castle, and the remains of the castle still exist somewhere around. But of course, what happened in the 1960s and through the 70s is the growth of the housing estates. And this has also been one of the things that, to my mind, has made the biggest changes in our countryside, because we've had two things at work. One is that we've had people abandoning urban areas, seeking something better. So the cities have been failing people because they've been allowed to decline, and people with the means have gone to look for a nicer place to live. And then the other thing that's been happening is that we've had an artificial inflation of the population of this country, which has been created by the migration. And I first really started to see what this was about and what it could do to our society when I was a parish councillor. And although people laugh about the parish council, and probably the vicar of Dibley comes into mind, the first thing I discovered from being a parish councillor was that you were able to see documentation which you wouldn't get as a normal member of the public. And one of the documents that I paid a lot of attention to was, which appeared in about the early 1990s, was called the Devon County Structure Plan. And this was a plan which set out the government's plans for the future development of Devon. But when you got into this document, it was very clear that the central part of this was to do with the number of houses that were going to be built. And in the first iteration of the document, it was talking about, I may have this figure slightly wrong, but I know it's in the right bracket. They were talking about 320,000, 340,000 houses to be built. But I noticed alongside this that when you went to see what they were going to do to improve the road infrastructure, there was very little information. When you looked to see what they were going to do to improve the rail infrastructure, there was almost nothing. And so you came to the conclusion at the end of the day, the plan was for the government to get this massive house building programme underway. And I took the trouble to follow the data back, and I ended up talking to the Office of National Statistics to ask them how this data on such a housing need, how this data was compiled and created. And they were very helpful in those days. They're a bit more guarded in what they say these days, but then they were very happy to tell me a lot about factors that produce the statistics for the housing. But then they said something very interesting, which is that, well, actually, when the figures left us, they were nowhere near 300,000. They were only about 120,000. And when I said, well, what basis has the government got for increasing the figures? They say, well, we don't know, because the moment we've done our work, it's out of our hands. What I now believe was going on was the government knew full well that it was going to enter a free border period for UK, let's do it that way. And therefore they knew that if they didn't build enough houses, people would start to realise that something was going on. Now, I can imagine a few people might think I'm being a bit conspiratorial here, but the more time has gone on, the more I'm sure that this is what was going on, particularly when a very nice lady contacted us many years ago. She'd worked for one of the inner London councils, Labour councils, and she talked about the policy of dispersing immigrants across the country so that the normal population of UK would not notice that there was this massive increase in immigration. And I better add the qualifying statement here, and that is that here we are. Here's a very large cooperative lorry arriving. No, the key point was that I have to get my brain back into gear now. Yes, for as far as the UK column's concerned, we've done this many times. We point out that Sir Peter Sutherland, who was the ambassador for migration in the UN, is on public record of saying that we need more mass migration in order to break down the homogeneity of the nation state. And so in talking and discussing the problems of immigration, we're not pointing a finger at the people who've moved country in search of a better life, but we can point a finger at agencies such as the UN, which were clearly helping to promote this unnatural inflation of the population in UK and I think it's true to say other Western European countries. And that directly impacts on everything, doesn't it? Because it's the housing, it's all of the strategic facilities, and it's also to do with food, because we have never been able, well, and since when? Since the Middle Ages, we've never really been able to feed the whole nation.
Hey, I mean, I think that's a significant part of it. I think on the planning side of it and the suggestion that there is a certain number of new houses that need to be built the entire time, that it exposes so many other corruptions within the system. One, like you quite rightly point out, is that there's never any interrogation of the statistics. You know, how are they arriving at these figures? It also demonstrates the throw it away rather than fix it culture, in that the urban areas that you're talking about are very seldom regenerated, or at least if they are, it's purely to increase the number of shops and sort of entertainment facilities that people can numb their minds with rather than housing. So the answer, of course, because that's where the money is to develop brownfield or increasingly greenfield sites, and it's too tempting. People, the local authorities, the developers, landowners cannot resist the amounts of money that everybody stands to make. And of course, the local authorities, in some respects, they see it as a win because they're able to fulfil the criteria that they haven't scrutinised, in that they can demonstrate they've honoured the commitment to put however many houses there and call it a sustainable development and all that kind of thing. But the other thing it highlights, which is very significant, particularly in light of what we talk about relatively regularly, being the doctrine of the lesser magistrates and effectively the duty of the lower tiers of authority, or the parts of the system to interpose and to do something about it. The trouble is, I mean, the great challenge is that at the parish council level, you're left with a choice, which is either you sort of roll the dice and accept that if you're not prepared for it, something might come your way in the form of an unjustified development that doesn't actually act towards the betterment of the area or the population, or you do something which is to produce a local plan, a local development plan, by which you can demonstrate to the one-up authority that you have a particular plan for the area, and whatever proposal doesn't accord with that plan. Of course, the problem with doing that is that if the the next authority, let's say the district council, the county council, if they are not minded to ratify that plan, then it's for naught, and that's how it continues to go up the system. And then, of course, at the top of it, all of this planning and development, exactly like I was talking about on yesterday's news, goes back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So it is incredible, but recounting details about parish council goings on, in actual fact, bears direct relation to what is being decided upon, if that's the right word, at United Nations level.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of people have no idea that they are willing participants in letting that, take hold. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Charles, we're back in the studio. That was a really pleasant walk, and I have to say that the Poppy clearly enjoyed herself as well. I think she'll be sleeping this afternoon. Yeah. But there we are. So thank you for being my first guest on Walking the Dog.
Brian, it's been an absolute privilege. Thank you so much. What a delight. And I'll perhaps look forward to doing it again at some point.
We will. We might go for a bit more of a shady environment.